The ink on the prenup was barely dry when Io met Remy's gaze and softly said, "You really think I'm nothing without you?" He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned back with a cold smirk and replied, "It's all business. You walk in with nothing, you walk out with nothing. That's fair." She stared at the paper. If they ever separated, she'd get zero. No joint assets, no fallback. Nothing. Still, she signed. Not because she agreed. But because she knew one day, the scales would tip. And when they did, he wouldn't see it coming. As Io slowly walked down the aisle, she tried to hold her smile steady. Her heart, though, was heavy. She wore a borrowed dress, plain and simple. Nothing glamorous, just all she could afford. She had no wealth. No family name that carried weight. No status. All she brought was love. Pure, unfiltered love. The night before the ceremony, Remy handed her the prenup. His voice was casual, but his words cut like glass. "It's nothing personal. Just business." Io's chest tightened. But she still took the pen and signed. Not because she believed in the agreement, but because she still believed in him. In love. At the wedding, she smiled for the cameras, but the murmurs in the crowd were louder than the vows. People weren't praising the romance or the ceremony, they were whispering about how she brought nothing into the marriage. That she didn't deserve someone like Remy. Still, Io remained composed. She looked into her husband's eyes, thinking love would be enough to carry them through. What she didn't know was that this marriage would become her greatest test, and that one day, everything would flip. After the wedding, Io expected a deeper bond to grow. But instead, things shifted. Subtly at first. Remy began to treat her like she was invisible. In public, he stopped calling her his wife. At corporate events, he introduced her with a rehearsed smile, "This is Io. She handles some logistics." No mention of her being his partner. No credit for standing by him. Just, a background character. In meetings, he acted like she didn't exist. Whenever she spoke up with a suggestion, he'd let out a heavy sigh and dismiss her with a half-smile, "Just be grateful you're even here." His words were calculated. Sharp. Designed to keep her in her place. And the people around him? They followed his lead. They treated her like a forgettable assistant, not the woman he had vowed to love. But Io didn't yell. She didn't fight back. She stayed quiet. Watchful. While he ignored her thoughts, she began observing everything, how deals were made, who mattered, what strategies failed, and which ones succeeded. And late at night, while Remy snored peacefully, Io sat alone at the dining table. Her old laptop humming, she wasn't journaling about her sadness. She was writing business plans. She wasn't sulking in silence, she was transforming it into fuel. Learning. Building. She devoured articles, watched online lectures, studied the basics of investing, tech, and entrepreneurship. Every harsh word from Remy only made her push harder. He thought she was fading into the background. But in truth, she was quietly rising. No one could see it. No one could guess. But Io was becoming something powerful. She had no wealth, no cheerleaders, and no backup plan. But she had her mind, and no prenup could ever strip that from her. While Remy put on a show for the world, Io was laying the foundation for something far greater. Quietly. Strategically. With every heartbeat, she grew stronger. Then, one rainy morning, as she sat near the window sipping tea and staring at the gray sky, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it. Probably spam, she thought. But something in her gut told her to answer. "Is this Io Adewale?" a man asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. "My name is Kenneth Lorne. I'm a lawyer. I'm reaching out about a distant relative, Mr. Amarty." The name was familiar but faint. One of those distant family figures who rarely showed up at weddings or holidays. A quiet man who'd lived far away, rarely spoken of. Io tried to recall who he was, when the lawyer delivered the bombshell. You've been named the sole heir of his estate. He left behind a trust worth $40 million. Io's breath caught. She said nothing. Her body froze. Her heart raced. At first, she thought it must be a scam. So she asked for proof. Kenneth calmly detailed the documents, signatures, and the legal history of the trust. It was all real. She couldn't believe it. $40 million. Her whole life had been uphill. Her marriage was one-sided. She had been dismissed, overlooked, and treated like she brought nothing of value. And now, without warning, she had become a millionaire. But she didn't scream. She didn't run to Remy. She didn't break down crying. She simply breathed in deeply and said, "Thank you for letting me know. I'd like to keep this confidential." No sudden celebrations. No impulsive moves. Because for the first time, the balance had shifted. The power was in her hands. And she wasn't going to waste it. She was no longer the woman with nothing. She was the woman who could now build anything. This moment wasn't just about money. It was about identity. About legacy. And no one, not even Remy, could see it coming. After learning about the inheritance, Io changed, nothing. She didn't tell Remy. She didn't suddenly splurge or celebrate. She woke up the next morning the same way she had the day before, early, quiet, and steady. She cooked breakfast, kissed Remy goodbye like always, and went about her day as though her entire world hadn't just shifted. Remy remained convinced that he was still the king of their castle. He still spoke down to her. Still acted like she had no worth, no options. Like she was just lucky to be in his orbit. Io let him believe it. Because sometimes, power doesn't need to be announced. It waits. It watches. Behind the soft smiles and routine chores, Io was moving differently. Quietly. She made private phone calls. Consulted with lawyers. Met with financial experts under aliases. She wasn't just planning, she was acting. Using a business name that no one could trace back to her, she began to invest. Not in flashy things. She didn't buy yachts or luxury cars. She bought smart. Modest properties. Small buildings. Quiet ownership. She handled everything herself, learning as she went. And then, she saw an opportunity. A gap in the tech space. A problem she knew she could solve. So she funded a small startup. Not with her name attached. Not as the face. She stayed behind the curtain. All the while, Remy still introduced her as, just the wife. And each time he did, Io simply smiled, because she knew he had no clue that the woman sitting beside him could walk out the door that very moment and be entirely self-sufficient. She wasn't waiting because she was scared. She was waiting because she was wise. Every insult, every time he brushed off her ideas, every moment he dismissed her, she used it. Not to get even. But to build something real. Something that wasn't tied to him at all. She wasn't creating for revenge. She was creating to stand. And soon, the tides began to turn, but not in the way Remy expected. His empire, once seemingly unshakable, began to crack. A major deal he had staked everything on collapsed overnight. Investors panicked. Partners withdrew. His accounts began bleeding money. Remy was furious. Panicked. Desperate. But instead of taking ownership, he lashed out. At his team. And at home, at Io. He became sharper with his words, colder with his glances. The tension in the house grew thicker with every passing day. Then, one night over dinner, it happened. The dining room was quiet, the clinking of silverware the only sound. Remy didn't say much. Until suddenly, without lifting his eyes, he said, "If you were smarter with finances, maybe we wouldn't be drowning." Io paused mid-bite. She didn't flinch. Didn't cry. Just stared at him silently. Not with hurt. But with a calm so deep it was almost unnerving. How could he say that? The man who once made her sign a paper that promised her nothing if she ever left, now accusing her of financial incompetence. The man who never asked for her opinion. Never valued her mind. Never once saw the storm quietly forming beside him. He had no idea. No clue she had already amassed properties, launched a business, and grown wealth he couldn't even imagine. He didn't know he was sitting across from a woman worth $40 million. She didn't respond. She took another bite of her food. Chewed slowly. Let the silence speak for her. Because in that moment, something changed inside her. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. She saw him clearly, his ego, his blindness, his desperation. And for the first time, she realized he had no idea who she truly was. And that was her greatest advantage. She didn't need to prove herself. One day, life would do it for her. That day arrived sooner than expected. A glittering tech gala. The kind Remy loved to attend. A room full of wealth, power, and people eager to shake hands and show off. Remy entered with the same artificial charm he always wore. Pretending everything was fine, even though his business was quietly collapsing. Io walked beside him, dressed with simple elegance, unassuming as ever. No one gave her a second glance. Until the host stepped up to the microphone. They had a special announcement. A private donor had just contributed $2 million to support women in tech innovation. The room buzzed. Who was it? Which corporation? Which mogul? Then the host smiled and said, "Please welcome the woman behind this incredible gift, Io Adale." The room went still. Every head turned. Remy froze, his smile evaporating as if someone had ripped the mask off his face. He turned toward her, eyes wide, disbelief washing over him like ice water. Io stood, composed and calm, and walked to the stage. She didn't stutter. She didn't fumble. She took the mic with grace and looked out at the crowd, her voice steady. "To every woman who's ever been told she brought nothing to the table," she said, "build your own." The audience erupted. Applause. Cheers. Tears. Cameras flashing. Phones recording. People rose to their feet. And Remy? He just sat there. Speechless. Motionless. Watching the woman he had tried to keep small rise in front of the entire world. That night redefined everything. The world had finally seen Io, not as Remy's wife, but as a visionary. A leader. A force. And Remy? He was left sitting in the echo of applause that wasn't for him. Io didn't look back at him as she stepped off the stage. She didn't need to. The message had already landed harder than any argument could. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't sought revenge. She had simply shown up in her truth, and the world noticed. That ride home was silent. But it was the kind of silence that screamed. Remy slammed the front door behind them. His footsteps heavy. His breathing short and sharp. He turned to her, fury barely hidden behind a nervous tremble. "How long?" he snapped. "How long have you been hiding this from me?" Io didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her hands calm at her sides, and replied softly, "I wasn't hiding. You just never looked." His eyes darted, searching her face for a trace of the woman he thought he knew. But she wasn't there. Because that woman, the one who tiptoed around his moods, the one who stayed small, she was gone. "I was trying to protect us," he said, his voice cracking now, reaching for excuses. "I didn't want to risk everything. That's why the prenup. Io tilted her head slightly, her expression not angry, just tired. You mean you didn't want to share? Remy stepped toward her, suddenly desperate. We can move past this. Forget the prenup. It doesn't matter anymore. We can start over. But Io had already let go. She remembered the night before the wedding, how he'd placed that paper in front of her like a business deal, not a promise. How he said, it's just business. And now, standing here years later, after all the silence, the dismissal, the erasure, he wanted to rewrite the past. But Io wasn't interested in edits. She was done with the story he wrote. The prenup, she said softly, was your idea. Remy's face collapsed. The weight of his choices sank in like cement. He had written her off, underestimated her, dismissed her worth. Now he wanted her back, but not for love. For what she had become. But Io didn't want revenge. She didn't want to destroy him. She just wanted peace. She had already moved on, emotionally, financially, spiritually. She had outgrown this version of her life. Remy was still stuck in the old chapter. But Io had started a new one long ago. A few weeks later, she did what she'd been preparing for. She filed for divorce. No loud announcement. No dramatic scene. Just quiet, resolute steps. She didn't ask for anything. Not the house. Not the cars. Not a share of the business. Not even what she'd once helped him build. She just signed the papers and walked away. Remy didn't understand. He expected a fight, a negotiation, a power struggle. But Io gave him none of that. Because she didn't need anything he had. She had already won. Not by taking, but by becoming. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Headlines read: Silent storm walks away without a penny, but owns the world. Millionaire wife leaves with nothing, and everything. Social media buzzed. Everyone wanted to know more. Who was the quiet woman who stood in the shadows for so long, and then left with her head high and her heart intact? But Io didn't engage. She didn't post statements. She didn't do interviews. She didn't need validation. Her freedom was her story. She left the home with one small suitcase. No drama. No bitterness. No need for closure. Just a clean break, from the man who never saw her. From a life that tried to shrink her. And from the version of herself that once thought love meant staying. Remy tried to reach her. He sent messages. Left voicemails. Asked mutual friends to speak on his behalf. But she never replied. Not out of hatred. But because there was nothing left to say. She had said it all, in silence. The world started calling her the silent storm. Not because she yelled. But because she never had to. Everything she did echoed louder than any words ever could. But Io didn't care for the name. She only claimed one word now. Free. And that word was enough. She didn't waste time flashing her wealth or throwing shade. That wasn't her way. Instead, she began building. Not for herself alone, but for others. For women like her. Women who were dismissed. Talked over. Overlooked. She thought back to all the times she was made to feel invisible. And she made a promise: no woman who wanted to grow would be left behind. That Io didn't announce her mission. She didn't post about it, didn't hold press conferences, didn't seek applause. She just acted. With part of her inheritance, she launched a scholarship fund, focused on girls from low-income backgrounds who wanted to study tech, engineering, and business. She remembered what it felt like to have no support. No one to invest in her dreams. So, she became the support someone else needed. She handpicked applicants who reminded her of herself, quiet, thoughtful, overlooked. She didn't put her name on the scholarships. The girls never knew who funded their futures. But she knew. And that was enough. Next, she began investing in small, women-owned businesses. Many of the women had been turned away by banks, laughed at by investors, or told their ideas were too ambitious. But Io listened. She asked questions. She took notes. And then, she wrote checks. Not for glory. But because she believed in them, the way she once wished someone had believed in her. Then came her boldest move yet. A tech incubator. A space created solely for women innovators. A place to dream. To build. To fail. To try again. She didn't name the building after herself, she didn't even show up at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Because she wasn't interested in branding. She was interested in impact. And slowly, her name began to carry weight, not because she chased fame, but because people saw the ripple effect of her work. They started asking, "Why don't you talk about all you're doing? Why don't you tell your story?" And she would smile gently and say, "Because silence is a language, too. Only the wise can hear it." She didn't need headlines. Her reward wasn't in applause. It was in watching lives change. In knowing she helped someone else build what she had once been denied. She wasn't just creating wealth, she was building legacy. Quietly. Intentionally. Powerfully. Her empire wasn't loud, but it echoed. She had become a respected figure in the business world, not for her net worth, but for her wisdom. She carried her success with grace. Never flashing. Always firm. And she never looked back. She didn't stalk Remy's social media. She didn't ask about him through friends. She didn't care. Because once you free yourself from a cage, you don't go checking the locks. She moved forward, step by quiet step. Remy, on the other hand, clung to her memory like a lifeline. At every event, he'd casually drop her name. "I was married to her, you know." He hoped it would impress people. Give him back some relevance. But it didn't. People nodded politely and moved on. Because the truth was, Io no longer needed his name. Her own name was more than enough. She began gracing magazine covers. She gave speeches, not about revenge, but about resilience. She was invited to panels, summits, and global leadership forums. Not because she demanded attention, but because she earned respect. She shared her story, but only to empower others. She talked about rising in silence. About strength that doesn't shout. And the world listened. Remy watched from afar as her face appeared in places he had only dreamed of. She had become someone the world admired. While he had become, just someone she used to know. No one mentioned his name anymore. It didn't follow hers. It faded. He sat alone in his once grand house. Sometimes, he looked at the prenup. The document he once held with pride. The paper that said she'd get nothing. At the time, he thought it protected him. He thought it would keep her small. But now, that paper meant nothing. Because what she walked away with couldn't be measured. She left with her freedom. Her dignity. Her power. And above all, her purpose. The empire she built, the lives she touched, the women she lifted, none of it came from what he gave her. It all came from what he failed to see in her. He didn't just lose a wife. He lost a future. A visionary. A legacy. A queen who didn't need a crown to rule. And the paper that truly changed her life? It wasn't the prenup. It was the inheritance letter. The business blueprints she scribbled late at night. The LLC registrations under names no one recognized. The silent choices. The deliberate steps. She walked away with nothing. But in reality, she left owning everything. And while Remy now uses her name like a story he once starred in, the world knows the truth. She was never his shadow. She was always a sunrise. He just never looked up. After Io walked away, she didn't slow down. She didn't stop to reflect, didn't dwell on the past. She moved forward with quiet certainty. She had nothing to prove. Not to Remy. Not to the public. Not even to herself. She had already done what so many thought was impossible. She rose without noise. She didn't throw her wealth around. She didn't buy billboards or mansions to show she had made it. She simply lived in purpose. And built. Every investment she made had intention. Every partnership had meaning. She started mentoring. Not through flashy programs or televised masterclasses, but through real, one-on-one relationships with young women who reminded her of herself. Women who had been ignored, spoken over, told to wait their turn. She taught them how to own rooms quietly. How to listen first. And then build something no one saw coming. Some of them were still figuring life out. Some had already been dismissed by the world. Io didn't care where they started, only that they dared to begin. She became a ghost investor in dozens of startups, never showing her face, but always planting seeds. And those seeds grew. Strong. She had no interest in credit. She wasn't chasing validation. The women she lifted didn't even know her name most of the time. And that's how she wanted it. Because her mission wasn't to be remembered. It was to make sure they had the tools to never be forgotten. She knew what it felt like to be invisible. Now, she made sure no one else had to feel that way again. And as her empire grew, so did her peace. She traveled more. Not for business, but for joy. She sat in quiet cafes in foreign cities, read books in parks, wandered museums where no one recognized her. She had everything, and yet needed nothing. Because for Io, success had never been about power. It was about freedom. Back in the city, Remy's name came up less and less. He still tried to use hers as a conversation starter. At conferences, dinners, parties. "I was once married to her," he'd say, hoping it still meant something. But people didn't light up. They didn't lean in. They just nodded vaguely and moved on. Because Io had become more than a name. She had become a symbol. A whisper that roared louder than a scream. A legend not for what she said, but for what she built when no one was watching. And Remy? He had become part of the cautionary tale. The man who thought a prenup would protect him. The man who believed he held all the cards, only to realize he never even knew the game. He still had his name, his empty house, his fading relevance. But he had lost the one thing that could have truly elevated his legacy. Not her money. Her vision. And now, while he rewatches her interviews online, searching for traces of the past, Io doesn't look back. She doesn't check his name. She doesn't speak his. Because he was just a chapter. And she? She was always the whole story. In the end, the most powerful document in her life wasn't the prenup he forced her to sign. It was the trust she inherited. The business plans she typed in silence. The non-disclosure agreements. The property deeds. The partnership contracts. And the letters she sent to other women, quietly funding their futures. Those were the papers that built an empire. And now, when people ask, how did she do it? The answer is always the same. She did it in silence. With strength no one saw coming. So if you've ever been underestimated. If anyone's ever told you that you bring nothing to the table. Remember this. You can build your own. Piece by piece. Silently. Powerfully. Unapologetically. And when it's done, they won't see it coming. But they'll never forget you. Share this with someone who needs the reminder, quiet women build loud legacies. Subscribe for more stories that honor silent strength, fierce resilience, and unstoppable growth. Thanks for watching.